Hey, boys and girls, buffaloes and bunnies. Weather report for January 3rd, 2022. How did I live this?
I will not get used to that until December 20th, 2022.
Yeah, well, it is a lot better than 2021. I don't know. But my God, how did this happen? How did this happen? Anyway, so I suppose I should probably address the thumbnail, the Weenie report. Danny and I had a little exchange in email, and I was once again saddened by the Fodorian attack on natural selection. So I just
the attack of the Fodors
again, huh? You guys were discussing it. Yeah,
we got to get that thump. That we got to figure out how we can make natural selection predict the thump noise that the heart makes. And if we don't do that, we just got to give up on this evolution. Evolution.
I just don't get that. Can it just be an emergent property? Like it's just right? I don't know.
Well, it's okay. I got something here. I got a book for Christmas called "The Origins of Genome Architecture" by Michael Lynch. And Michael Lynch is one of the people that are pretty mad at natural selection, or at least he's mad at a particular version of talking about it, where it's called a theory, or it's where it's relied on entirely, like it's the whole story. Like natural selection is going to give you the whole story of how life ended up here and how it ended up as divergent as it is. And he makes some comments about it. I'm going to see if I can put those comments up on the screen. PDFs. Let's see. And we should make them full screen. Now, this is a little hard to see because it's kind of an odd copy, but he says, let's see, a vast chasm of stepwise. Okay, now forget that. Second, the uncritical acceptance of natural selection as an explanatory force for all aspects of biodiversity. Now, if you just read the first part, natural selection as an explanatory force, now you're agreeing with Danny, okay? But he continues with that sentence with, as for all aspects of biodiversity, and that's where it fails. Without any direct evidence, it's not much different than invoking an intelligent design without any direct evidence, okay? And then down here, we have true. We've actually seen natural selection in action in a number of well-documented cases of phenotypic evolution. I'm reading from a distance here. But it is a leap to assume that selection accounts for all evolutionary change, particularly at the molecular and cellular levels. And now what he's talking about is neutral theory and a few other things about stochastic processes that have a major effect on what the outcome is, what actually ends up out there. And I think if you rewound the universe and had very slightly different conditions, we would end up with very, very different animals and different body plans. And in fact, there probably wouldn't be any humans at all. Very unlikely there would. The blind worship of natural selection is okay. Hang on.
Yep, go ahead.
The blind worship of natural selection is not evolutionary biology. It is arguably not even science. Natural selection is just one of several evolutionary mechanisms. And the failure to realize this is probably the most significant impediment to a fruitful integration of evolutionary theory with molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. And that last part is the the rest of the story, right? Like if you want to know about thump noises, and if you want to know what traits are going to be out there in the population, you're going to have to add that last part, molecular, cellular, and developmental biology, along with ecology and geology and physics and everything else, you know? So what natural selection is, it's a simple, very basic part of it. It's a mathematical law, basically, or reality, mathematical reality about what happens when you have variation, mutations, and you have large populations that are reproducing and passing down some sort of information from generation to generation. And each of these organisms lives in an environment where it either lives or it dies. You know, it either reproduces or it doesn't. It either reproduces really well, you know, has 100 children, or it reproduces very badly, has 0.01 children, that sort of thing. And anytime you have a system like that, we don't care what traits there are. That's not what we're talking about. With natural selection, the mathematics of natural selection and the power of it is in population genetics, and it's sort of the numerical accounting of biology, but it's not going to tell you the qualitative aspects of what's going to be in life. No one ever said it. Well, no one ever said it did, but yet there are some people that these biologists fight all the time about how they talk about things, which is semantics. You know, there's semantical problems, but everybody understands the complexity of what we're dealing with. So go ahead, David.
Oh, I was just agreeing with you. That's all. And you got an echo too.
What?
Yep.
Not again. What does this always pop up at this time of the fucking, what the? I'm going to have to leave and come back. I'll be right back. And we'll see if it goes away.
Well, that puts a lot of pressure on us now, guys.
Yep.
Well, David, man, have you got a fever?
You know, I feel like I maybe very mild, but I haven't even checked it, to be honest with you.
How about now?
Oh, he asked me if I had a fever.
Oh.
I feel like I might have very slight, but I haven't even checked it.
Yeah, you need to check. Do I have an echo?
Nope, you're good.
Not at the moment.
I don't have a fever either.
Well, that's great. Do you have a fever for the flavor of a Pringles?
Oh, yeah.
The biggest problem is trying to get tested. You know, it's hard to get, like, you can't, it's hard to get tested.
You got a
there's
home
like
test?
waiting and.
I know.
Yeah, so it's a bitch, yeah.
I called up. I wanted to go to the clinic and get a test, and you wouldn't believe the shit they put you through.
Yeah.
It's like you got to make an appointment, and you got to have some reason or referral, and it's like, wait a minute, this is my goddamn clinic.
Yeah, that's what it is here. I mean, you can go and they take walk-ins, but if you walked in there at like 7 o'clock in the morning, you can probably get right in. But if you don't, like, depending on when you go, you could be there for hours waiting, and yeah, it's a bitch.
Yeah.
So
what do they call this? Pan-selectionism, I think, is a negative word for being over-reliant on natural selection or something. But anyway, the final thing I want to say about natural selection is the most important part about it is that it is purifying selection, the part that cuts out the things that don't work at all. So right away you've got you have this I hate the word random, but you have random mutation, sort of a stochastic process. It's not as random as that would imply, but anyway, so when you have that, you have a whole lot of things that aren't going to work, and those get cut out right out of the gate oftentimes before fertilization even happens. You've got a non-viable egg, or you have a non-viable zygote or whatever. So it ends up chopping out a whole lot of things that don't work. And what it leaves is things that do work rather well, and other things that can work maybe in some other environment or could work in the future or whatever. And all of those things are laying around. But there's nothing about natural selection that tells you which of those things are going to develop into traits that interact with an ecology and end up, being in a future generation. And that's just not that's not anything anyone should ever think it can do. And so we're not making the claims that they're firing back against. And that, and that's why I keep telling them, the other thing is that there are a lot of us, there are a lot of biologists that want to tell people to shut the fuck up and learn how to talk about natural selection and evolution, right? And so we're kind of on the side of Fodor in saying, hey, you don't want to use a certain kind of language, right? So basically,
right. Yep.
So when Danny and even Ozzy come at us with this criticism, I always say it's almost like you're asking me, when did I stop beating my wife? The thing is that we kind of agree with you anyway, on semantics and language and what the scope of natural selection is. It doesn't just cut out the unfit. It results in differential success, thus preserving more adaptive traits. Yeah. And that's the positive selection, and then purifying is the negative selection. But the most important part is that purifying or negative selection. I just heard an echo.
Yeah, that was coming through Scott.
Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know. Enough said about that. What else we got going on? So I guess seals thwart evolution. Did you know that?
What? Say that again? What?
Seals.
Yeah.
And walruses and pinnipeds.
Oh, thwart.
Thwart. They thwart.
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 We have a new word today, kids. Thwart. Can you say thwart?
Can you say thwart?
It's like you're saying the wart, but you're forgetting to finish the E. So it's thwart.
Can you say thwart really fast? Thwart. Okay. Let me cut that out. Oh my goodness. I have too many things. Too many things. Okay.
Things can be a problem if there's too many of them.
Yep. Oh, this could be the thing. Okay. The thing ain't working. Hold on a second. We're going to fix this thing. Nope. Maybe we aren't. Yes, we
So
are.
are you going to elaborate on Danny's email at all, or no? You don't?
Well, the email was just the back and forth that he came out, and the last thing he said, I was basically I told him to go read a book. We had a little bit of words between us, as we do. Me and Danny love each other. So there was that. Let's see. Okay. Hang on a second. Scrungy. Okay, the last thing he said to me is NS isn't explanatory given that it cannot differentiate between co-referring trait terms traits. Okay, first of all, did we say that natural selection itself was going to explain those things? No one ever did. So, end of story. Straw man.
Yeah,
We never said that.
Realize the problem, yeah.
No one ever said that the mathematics of population genetics and natural selection and even genetics was going to tell you whether or not fish were going to grow limbs. It just isn't how it works. I'm sorry. So this is pinnipeds, fascinating creatures that thwart evolution. And this is on the wonderful site Creation.com. Creation.com? Creation Ministries International.
So that's a creationist site.
Peer-reviewed scientific facts, straight from the lab is what we get here, right? And they go on and they talk about pinnipeds for a while, but I'm trying to figure out where they.
Yeah, these guys have outstanding CVs and everything.
Oh, they do, and you can have them for $79.99 or $95. And you can learn and learn and learn about why the Bible tells you about evolution. Okay, I've been documented, yet evolutionary scientists are still uncertain about their alleged ancestry. So apparently, is this how it thwarts evolution? That, there's still some controversy about the phylogeny. According to one view, seals evolved from raccoons and weasels along North America's Atlantic coast. Yeah. Are they saying we don't know something? Oh my God. That thwarts us totally. Nothing thwarts.
I don't understand alleged ancestry. I guess they're saying that this was a particular species that was specially created by God. God, and isn't like descended from any other species. So I guess that's consistent with creationism, but surely they've done genetic tests and are able to compare it to other genera or species and find a relation.
Yeah.
Are they?
I don't know. I was distracted, Scott. I'm sorry. Anyway.
Yeah, you were distracted. Topdawg and David are asleep. That's okay. No problem.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No,
Okay.
I'm not.
Say that again, Scott.
No, I was just curious as to why they're saying alleged ancestry. Is it because they don't believe that animals have ancestors?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. The seal kind. Well, how many kinds are involved in this pinnipeds, right? The walrus kind, the seal kind. I'm not entirely sure. Okay. They claim though that they came from animals that originally lived exclusively on land. I don't know much about that. Do you? Does it matter? Well,
seal ancestry?
They didn't come from fish.
Well, if they came from fish, if they came from land animals, it's okay because they're animals and they just need to be classified.
Yeah, but I don't think anybody's claiming they came from fish.
I would doubt it.
Yeah, so they ended up so the ancestral line was on land and then went back to the sea, kind of like whales did. But anyway, so let's see. For land animals to evolve back into the sea is so implausible. Comparing it to winning the lottery multiple times would be an understatement. Oh my goodness. Who wrote this? Who the fuck? Matthews? Who's he? Okay, let's go see who this guy is.
You really got to stop getting all your education from these creation sites because I'm really starting to worry about you.
Well, yeah, I figure, it's costing me thousands of dollars to get this information. I thought the amount you paid for your education would have something to do with the quality, right?
Yeah, exactly. It should, but
yeah.
Well, I don't know.
Okay,
Maybe you're just not studying hard enough. Maybe that's what it is.
Kerhati came to Christ after high school in Hungary. Okay. But after studying biology at the university, he struggled with harmonizing the book of Genesis with evolutionary theory he was being taught. After a few years of this struggle and being exposed to information on creation, he came to understand that the evolutionary worldview and gospel are in opposition to one another. Okay, that was his mistake. That's where he went off the rails. In that evolution uses death as a natural process. But according to the Bible, death is the last enemy and a consequence of man's sin. So we're responsible for animals eating each other?
Somehow. These pinnipeds are damn cute.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, little cutie. Oh,
okay. So, as a PhD in biology. Ooh. Wonder where he got that. He received a master's in science from Iotavas, Lauren University in Budapest. Call me Ozzy. Should we call you Ozzy?
Well, if it isn't Ozzy, how are you doing today, Ozzy?
Hey,
we can call you Ozzy. Hey. So how are you?
Hi, gentlemen. Can you hear me all right?
We can now. Yeah.
Great.
Can hear
Thank
you
you.
now.
Thanks for the link. Happy New Year, everyone.
Yep.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Likewise. Carry on. I was just interested in the photo discussion, so I thought I'd pop in, but I don't want to derail anything.
Well, the
Give
photo
us your thoughts.
the photo discussion is a little frustrating for people that study evolution because it depends on how you frame it. Now, I have heard certain people, certain Wiener-like people, say out loud that natural selection. Do you know the joke there? You know who I'm referring to?
No, I don't know who the winner is.
I'm referring to Danny. Call him a little weenie, but we don't get along so well. But anyway, what the hell was I? So, and I totally lost my train of thought. My train of thought derailed.
Do you know Danny Oz?
I've heard it mentioned in these live streams before. That probably have crossed paths in the live chat if it's a regular viewer. But
He goes way back. He goes way back into the Discord or maybe Pal Talk and stuff. And I know you do too. So I'm sure you probably. He's a good friends with Jack Anstrike, which I think you know him too.
Yeah. Sure. I was never part of Pal Talk or that Pal Talk crowd, but I know those individuals because before Discord became the thing, there was this thing called Google Plus that I was part of, and there were Google Hangouts. So back in the day, Hangouts were thriving. I met those people. I don't know who Danny is in particular, but I'm sure we crossed paths.
Yep. So Danny has stated out loud over and over that we should not use the term natural selection at all, and that evolutionary science is not really science, but it's just history. It's just a historical endeavor, and that all of evolutionary science is historical. And for people that study genetics and population genetics and bioinformatics and all of that every day, that is like a slap in the face, and it makes our heads explode.
Yeah.
Because
I wouldn't agree with that.
You wouldn't agree with that we should completely toss it out and just say, it's not science, it's just bookkeeping. Butterfly.
Yeah, I would not agree with that. I mean, I actually agree with Fodor's objection. I don't think it implies everything he thinks it implies, but I actually agree with the substance of his objection. You and I have talked about this in private, actually.
Yeah. Well, his objection would land on like particularly pop science articles where they overstate the role of natural selection, or they talk about it in a godlike way, like this Michael Lynch book that I just read. The excerpt from, he's one of the people that don't like that kind of talk, right? He would agree with what does land in Fodor's criticism. And, to be fair, Fodor got people thinking about this in ways that they probably hadn't thought about it before, which is good. I
agree with that, yeah.
And that's, you bring a philosopher into the house and you have him to dinner, and he does that. He does his job, and then you kick his ass back out and let him sleep on a bench. I agree with that.
I think a little bit differently there. My assessment of Fodor is a little higher than that. And including his contribution. And I it's absolutely true that Fodor's objection lands with people that are sort of naive evolutionists in their thinking, that sort of over apply natural selection and just are constantly attributing everything to natural selection. Every trait that we find, they assume is an adapted trait.
Right? Yeah.
And that's obviously that kind of Panglossian paradigm, that the just so storytelling type. Obviously, it lands with them. But Fodor's objection is meant to cut deeper than that. His point is that there is no case where the theory of natural selection itself, that the theory of natural selection per se, that it ever explains which traits are adaptive and which ones are merely, they're just, coextensive with an adaptive trait. That it's always something outside the theory of natural selection that allows us to disambiguate that it's the beating of the heart and not the thump noise, for instance, right?
Right.
And now, what's funny is that a lot of evolutionary theorists, when they hear this, will just they'll balk, and their heads will explode. Massimo Pigliucci is a perfect example of that, of someone whose head kind of exploded when he heard about this, and had a kind of head-to-head sort of live debate years ago on, was it Infidel Radio or something, or Infidel Guy podcast. The two of them went at it, hammer and tongs. It was a great discussion. If you haven't heard it, I recommend it. Look up Infidel.
I want to see that.
Okay. Yeah, look up Infidel Guy, Jerry Fodor, and you'll see there's an exchange there with Massimo Pigliucci. And Massimo is simply understanding the objection, but simply denying the conclusions. I think if they had that conversation today, it would go very differently. I think Massimo has had time to sort of process the objection, and I think would concede a lot of ground now. That's my intuition. Because he seems like an eminently reasonable man, and I think he was kind of reacting and attributing a lot of motives to Fodor, that he was somehow anti-evolution or even doubted natural selection, that kind of stuff, which Fodor does not. He does not question the fact of natural selection. He doesn't question evolutionary theory. He doesn't question common descent or anything like that. What he's calling into question is whether or not there are within natural selection theory itself the conceptual tools for disambiguating which traits are selected for and which ones are just selected of, or just sort of free riders. And his point is precisely, no, there's nothing in the theory that could possibly do that. That's impossible. And so, as he says, biologists are smarter than their theory. They're not relying on the theory to disambiguate these, which traits are coextensive and which ones are actually relevant to adaptation. They're using something else. They're using their understanding of biological systems, of chemistry, of physics, of ordinary biology, developmental biology, and all of that stuff, embryology, everything. They're bringing all of that to bear, and then it disambiguates. And then they're crediting natural selection with that. But in fact, natural selection doesn't have the conceptual apparatus with it to do that. It all comes from outside. It comes from an independent understanding of natural systems, specifically the physical systems of the organisms that they're looking at and the environments in which they find themselves. That's Fodor's objection. I think that cuts actually pretty deep. And so my view is that Fodor is right. This does not threaten natural selection as a fact. It just means that it didn't explain some of the things that we credit it with explaining. And since natural selection has traditionally, and to this day, even among biologists, is understood as the theory that explains specifically adaptations, then people are misunderstanding their own theory. Because we are able to explain adaptations, and we do use natural selection. We just don't use natural selection to explain the adaptations.
Well, this Michael Lynch paragraph here, where he says natural selection is just one of several evolutionary mechanisms. Now, calling natural selection a theory is wrongheaded, right? Even though it's sort of our common name for it, but it's a theory of evolution. And natural selection is simply one of the mechanisms that are in there. I mean, you've got to have mutation, you've got to have genetics, you've got recombination. The heart and the thump noise. Far better example is gene linkage. Where if you have a gene A, and it has a massively positive effect on the reproductive success of the population, right? Mm-hmm. And it happens to be linked, like right next door to a gene B, which has a disadvantage for the organism, right? Yeah. But those two genes are always going to come together, and there's going to be some melding or mixing of the fitness advantage from A minus whatever B does to the organism. And it isn't going to be until some very, very rare event separates those two genes. Because in order for recombination to hit a particular spot and separate two genes, it's kind of like shooting a can on Mars with a .22 rifle, right? I mean, it's a very rare event. It happens. Yeah. And but the thing is,
may I interject?
Yeah, go ahead.
If that's okay. Fodor is not suggesting that the whole of evolutionary theory is constituted by natural selection. He's not saying natural selection is the name of the big theory of evolution. He's not saying that. He's happy to say, well, look, of course, there's pleiotropic effects. There's gene drift and founder effects and all of that. There's all kinds of non-adaptive evolution, right? I mean, you know, remove all selective pressures. Just imagine if you were to remove all selective pressures so that organisms could all just freely reproduce or something like that. You'd still get differential reproductive success because you'd have some organisms that just can leave more surviving offspring because they leave, let's say, you know, they leave twice as many offspring. They just, they tend to have more twins or something like that. So even if there was no selection going on, nothing was filtering anything out, you'd still get a change in allele frequencies, right? So Fodor is not making the mistake. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see he's not making the mistake of suggesting that natural selection constitutes the whole or even the largest part of evolutionary theory. He understands there's all kinds of mechanisms. What he's saying is that the part of natural selection, or rather the part of evolutionary theory that is really, really interesting to us, is the part that explains adaptation, right? It's fitness, right? It's about fitness preserving, fitness conferring traits. And so it's always been natural selection that was the linchpin of explaining that. But his point is precisely, oh, wait a minute, though, there's a problem. It's not natural selection that tells you which are the fitness conferring traits. We independently are able to assess that from a bioengineering standpoint, by looking at the environment in conjunction with the environment. We're able to make the assessment of that. And then we understand that we have this filtering process, and natural selection can work like an algorithm. But what natural selection can't tell you is which are the fitness conferring traits, and that has always been what has been laid at the doorstep in praise of natural selection, that it explains the fitness conferring traits. And his point is, no, that's what it can't do. But we're able to do that. We were able to do that before. Well, I mean, we always knew that it was the circulation of the blood, the heart acting as a pump that was relevant, not the noises that were relevant to why organisms have hearts, right? And it's, that we didn't need natural selection for that. We were able to do that before, right? So that can't be what the contribution of natural selection is in evolutionary theory. We had that already. Natural selection contributes something else, but in other words, it doesn't explain what we thought it explained, and we've been overpraising it. We have been bestowing sort of laurel wreaths at the feet of natural selection that it does not deserve, that it does not do, and we just need to be straight on what natural selection does explain and what it doesn't explain.
Yeah, and if Fodor
not that it's not a part or that it's not real. He thinks natural selection is real. It's just doesn't do, from an explanatory or epistemological standpoint, what it's credited with doing.
Okay, if he had written that paper in 1940, he probably would have had a hit, because back then that's about when our thinking started to change on all of this. And it was about the 1960s when we came up with neutral evolution, and we started to understand genetics, that evolutionary biology, its face changed, went from modern synthesis and very quickly stepped into the extended synthesis, which is where we're at now. So, I mean, it's almost like crying wolf, the boy crying wolf in the dark. Nobody's listening. But yeah, it's, so it's valid. Yeah, it's valid. That put that way, and attacking that particular audience, it's valid, but it doesn't cover anything. Well, in fact, I haven't even heard the term natural selection all that much, and I study this stuff every day. Mm-hmm. It's almost like with creationists, I have never heard I've never heard more about Darwin until I got involved with creationists, right? I mean, you can study evolutionary biology for years and years, and you'll see Darwin's name 3 times, because no one gives a shit anymore. It's like we move beyond this, and that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that what is the ask here? And who are you asking? Who are you asking not to do this? What are the specifics? Who are the specific people that are claiming this adaptation? Of course, there's the evolutionary psychologists, right? Back in the late 90s and the 2000s, and they just completely fucked up with their just so stories and their adaptionist ideas about psychology, right? Those guys deserve that criticism, and maybe Fodor was responding to that. Well, in fact, he was. He says in his paper that he started out as a criticism of evolutionary psychology, and he decided to extend it, greater. That's what he says in, I think it was a 2008 paper or something. I can't remember which, but anyway.
Yeah, but it's not limited to that. His point is that it's easy to see the mistake when people are over applying it, right? But his point is, even in those cases where people think they're not over applying it, they're still misapplying the theory. That they're still crediting the theory of natural selection with something that it doesn't and can't do.
Got an example?
Well, yeah, the thump and the heart is a perfect example, right?
Yeah, but I mean, who's ever said that? Who's ever said natural selection?
You can pick up almost any book by Richard Dawkins, for instance. Read anything by Stephen Jay Gould, right? He credits things, and Stephen Jay Gould was someone who was like, along with Richard Lewontin, very, very opposed and allergic to the idea of sort of
fitness,
selectionism, and the Panglossian paradigm, or the adaptationist paradigm, as they sometimes called it. I mean, they were very much opposed to that, but they still make the mistake that Fodor is charging them with, that is crediting natural selection with certain things, right, as being the explanation for adaptations. Right? So I mean, it's endemic. It's throughout. I mean, you can't even take a course in evolutionary biology in university. I've taken these courses. You can't even take a course in evolutionary biology, especially if you're taking something, more along the molecular biology route, you probably won't notice it because natural selection scarcely comes up in such courses. But if you're taking courses in evolutionary ecology, for instance, you're just going to be hit over the head with this. So I mean, everyone goes through this, comes out the other side, and then it's like you say, it's like, you learn about Darwin in your intro course, and then you don't have to talk about it again because it's assumed. And it's the same thing with natural selection. You learn explicitly about natural selection, what it does and doesn't explain, when you should and shouldn't apply it, and then you forget all about it. You never have to talk about it again because it's a shared assumption within the community of evolutionary biologists. So it doesn't need to be mentioned again, but it doesn't mean that the assumption isn't being made, that it isn't implicit, and that it's not even explicit whenever they're just talking about it casually with people and even amongst themselves. So, I mean, think about it. I mean, look, I've seen people in these live streams, yourself and others in these live streams, sort of bristle at the suggestion that it's not natural selection that allows us to distinguish between the beating of the heart and the thump noises, which is relevant to our survival and why hearts exist and persist, right? People here in these live streams have sort of bristled at that. Well, that's exactly what Fodor is talking about. Look, if you think that that's objectionable, you think the theory explains that, you need to explain how it explains that, because see what the resources are in the theory. There's lots of resources outside the theory by which we can explain why we appeal to the pump functions of the heart as opposed to the noise that the blub noises that a heart makes. But that's external to the theory, right? That's not part of the theory that Darwin came up with.
Well, this guy goes on and talks a little bit more about Darwin, and so some of the things that he did. And Michael Lynch claims that I forget what it was exactly. I'd have to read this, but let's see. He's talking about Dawkins versus Darwin. But he talks about some of the other things that Darwin did, and natural selection is often exaggerated when it comes to Darwin and what he did. He taught us other things. But I mean, this idea of I don't know of anybody that would tell you that the mechanism of natural selection alone is going to tell you about the thump and the heart noise, the pumping of the blood, right?
Well, I mean, if someone said the following, the reason we have hearts is because natural selection selected for the heart as a pumping of blood, as opposed to an organ that makes certain noises. If anyone ever said anything like that, then they're making the mistake that Fodor is alleging that people are making. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that I've heard said in these very live streams. I don't want to lay this at the doorstep of any particular person here because I don't remember who was in the live stream. I expect some of you were here when these sorts of statements were made. So maybe you might have said these things.
The idea
in mind about that, I don't know. So
the idea that even circulation itself can be explained as an adaptation, to me, is distasteful. I mean, it's the thing that can be explained is this very, very small incremental change from one generation to another, or in a population where a certain feature will drift into what is it called? Fixation. Basically, it'll drift into fixation as a result of being selected, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having an advantage. But to say that explains why there is circulation, I mean, in all animals that have circulation, when you go all the way back and look at the entire story of how circulation came to be, that would be a ridiculous thing to think, that we're explaining it, that there was some mechanism that caused circulation to be in biodiversity the way it is. I mean, I don't think anybody would say that. There was some mechanism that caused circulation to be in who's doing that? Huh.
I think that might have been me.
Oh, okay.
Apologies for that.
Okay. Anyway, so I mean, it's just, that is wrong-headed, and if that's all they're saying, then here, I'm all for it. That is not how circulation came to be a thing. And when you look at hearts and thump noises, you have to be very, very careful, because thump noises can also have an effect on fitness, and we know that. And it does, in fact, have something to do with mammals, and it has been. And it didn't develop because we needed it for something, but it ended up getting utilized by mammals for something else after the fact. Okay.
Right. But consider something like, sorry, I thought you were done.
Okay. There's all these things that end up being free riders, right? They're free riders, and it's the free riders that account for diversity, because the free riders in some future population end up having a function, and that is the key to neutral evolution and to drift, and that's the thing that an adaptationist or a strict adaptationist would miss. They would think that, the thing is not going to happen, or it's not going to be important until it's adaptive, right? Until there's some reason for it to be there. But I mean, it could be a free rider, like the noise that the heart makes, and it could end up having an effect in the future. And there is a possibility that the thump noise could get a mammal killed if there was a predator that had sufficiently developed hearing to track it. But the thump noise and bonding maternally, or maternal bonding, is something that mammals have they've co-adapted that thing, and it ended up using it for something, right? It ended up being part of our mammalian constitution, because it was a free rider along with circulation, along with muscles.
That's going to be the newsletter, the name of the newsletter we start on this channel, the
Free
Mammalian Constitution.
Mammalian what?
Constitution.
Oh, there we go. Mammalian Constitution.
There you go. See, that's
like
a newspaper name.
I don't want to beat a dead horse here, because I know I can tell that people are sort of tired of talking about this. I sort of gauging from the live chat, people are a bit weary of this discussion. So let me just say one last thing, sort of to address your challenge. Where you say, like, who's saying this stuff? I mean, every time a biologist, someone in the field of evolution, says that eyes are for seeing, hands are for grasping, hearts are for beating, whenever they say something that X is for Y, and they credit natural selection with it, right?
Yeah.
And they say that this was selected for this reason, they're falling into the error that Fodor says they're making, that is being made consistently throughout the field. Because to say that something is for something else is to appeal to a function, and it's precisely what natural selection cannot do. because selection is an intentional with an S, not intentional as in intentionality. Is intentional with an S. It's not extensional. It's an intentional trait, not an extensional trait. And natural selection cannot distinguish between coextensive terms or traits this way, unless natural selection has a way of distinguishing between functions. And natural selection doesn't have a mind. It cannot discriminate between intentional with an S descriptions.
There's no normative standard to appeal to.
It has to be done extensionally.
Appeal to function.
Yeah.
What's that?
I said there's no normative standard one can appeal to prescribe the concept of function.
That's right. That's right. Natural selection can't do that because the notion of a function is teleological, and even if you go with, as I would prefer, a teleonomic notion, there's still a standard to which you're appealing there, and that's precisely what natural selection, being completely blind, unguided, and purposeless, cannot do. That's just as a matter of simple logic, it's impossible. Now, what I think the difficulty here for a lot of people, though, a lot of biologists, is they don't know the difference between intentional predicates and extensional predicates. If you don't have that distinction in mind, you're not going to see the objection. So the force of the objection is only going to make sense if you understand what an intentional predicate and an extensional predicate is. And maybe we can discuss that sometime, or But anyway, I don't want to flog a dead horse here. So I didn't mean to dominate the conversation. So
I think they fully understand that, even if they don't understand that particular way of depicting the problem. And I don't think the problem is with natural selection at all, or with the ideas of natural selection. The problem is with some people and their way of talking and thinking. And what you just described is what's wrong with functionalism, basically. And there's a lot wrong with functionalism in thinking in biology. It is we run into trouble with the ENCODE project, and what is functional, and information, and all of that stuff. There's just a lot of wrong-headed thinking. But the populace probably doesn't have a really good grasp of how evolution works. I will agree with that, and we need that. But the way to get at it is, I don't think it's the way that Danny or Jerry Fodor or any of those people approach the problem.
I have a question. So this is not my area of expertise, and Ozzy, I appreciate your kind of articulating your positions on this, because
you're articulating it a lot better than it has been done in the past.
I absolutely can appreciate this, like what you're saying. And I don't know if I have the expertise to delve into this, because when I was thinking about it, I kept thinking, well, so natural selection can't delineate between these a free rider trait and another particular trait, but it's selecting for these massive traits that it cannot distinguish between those. Isn't that still mean that it's distinguishing? It can't distinguish between the traits, but it is distinguishing for some environmental pressure which has an association with those traits.
Yes, that's exactly right. So in other words, natural selection is like this coarse filter, but what we're doing is we're insisting that it's actually filtering for the thing that we know, without having to avert to the theory of natural selection. We know independently that it's got to be selecting for the pumping of the blood, or the fact that we can see with our eyes, and it's visual acuity that's being selected for. But in fact, it's just this whole panoply of traits that are coextensive. And natural selection cannot discriminate between all of these coextensive traits, because it can't distinguish functions, because it's not a mind. It's an unguided, mindless process. And the notion of a function is intentional with an S. It's not extensional.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. It's not that natural selection doesn't select. But it's not selecting in the way that we think. It's not selecting for. Everything is selection of.
Yeah.
And then we figure out what had to have been causally relevant, what had to have been being preserved here, right? But there's nothing in the theory that would allow you to do that, because natural selection, being a blind process, is not the kind of thing that can do that. We can do that. The theory cannot provide us with what we're able to do. That is all extra theoretical. That's his objection. He doesn't object to anything in evolutionary theory. He doesn't object to natural selection or anything like that. He doesn't think it doesn't happen. It's just not doing the explanatory work that we credit it with, and we all assume. And it's sort of a revelation when people go, "Oh yeah, that's kind of weird." Nothing changes. Like I have an analogy that I can give here. I believe speed of sound. You and I have talked about this. Supposing I said to you, I suppose you come to me and you say, I want to invest in the stock market, Ozzy. I hear you do pretty well in the market. You got any advice for me? And I say, yeah, I got some advice. I have advice that is absolutely foolproof. Believe me, if you follow my advice here, my investment strategy in the market, you're always going to make money. In fact, you're never going to lose money. In fact, my strategy is so foolproof that anyone who ever made money in the markets made it by following this principle. And anyone who ever lost money lost it because they didn't follow my advice. So do you want to hear my advice? Surely you'll want to hear my advice if what I'm saying is true. And it is true. Here's my advice. Buy low, sell high. Okay? Now, that is absolutely true. If you follow that advice, you will make money. In fact, everyone who makes money buying and selling things on the stock market, buying stocks, makes money by buying when it's low and selling when it's high, and vice versa, right? There are other things you can do. There are other financial instruments. But if you're just buying and selling stocks, simpliciter, this is how you do it. This is how you make money. Now, you would look at me and you'd go, Ozzy, that's your advice? That's your bloody advice? Buy low, sell high? And I'll go, yeah, it's true. And you'll go, yeah, of course it's true, but it doesn't tell me what the hell to buy and when to buy it and what to sell and when to sell it. And you'll say, look, this is not practical. And I'll say, oh, wait, yeah, you just got to go out and do some homework and like study up on stocks and make predictions about the market, about what people will want to buy and what's likely that.
This is a really good example.
You go, damn it, Ozzy. Yes, your principle is correct. In fact, it's irrefutable. It's practically a truism. So it's not false. It's not worthless. It's absolutely true. It's completely descriptive, descriptively accurate. The problem is that it's explanatorily vacuous. It only has a post hoc value, but predictively it is worthless. I can't predict, what I need to sell and when, and what I need to buy and when to buy it, and that's what I need to do to make money, Ozzy. And you'd be right. And that is sort of the kind of criticism that Fodor. This is my own analogy, but this is the kind of criticism that Fodor is bringing here. He's saying, look, of course we can explain things with natural selection ex post facto by bringing in all of this other information that is not part of the theory. But the theory doesn't provide us with what we need to make the actual predictions, except in the most general level. Just as my prediction about how to make money in the market does make predictions. I can predict who's going to make money and who's going to lose money after the fact, and I can explain correctly after the fact why they lost or why they made money. Right? So I can explain things, but I'm explaining things at a level of generality and abstraction so high, so divorced, that it's actually not doing the nitty-gritty work of explaining. The nitty-gritty work of explanation happens outside of the principle that I provided you with. And Fodor's objection is basically analogous to this. He's saying, yes, biologists are smarter than their theory. They don't rely on their theory to make these explanations.
Okay.
And it fits and is perfectly consistent with natural selection. It cannot be consistent with natural selection. It has to be consistent, otherwise it won't work. But the theory is not doing the work that they think it is.
I have a strong objection to something you said a little while ago that I think will clear all this up, right? You said there's nothing in the theory that tells you about this, that you have to go outside of the theory.
Right.
And that's where we're going wrong about this. There is no theory of natural selection. You're kind of conflating the theory of natural selection with the theory of evolution. Now, the theory of evolution, what does it encompass? It encompasses natural selection as one of the mechanisms, as one of the core mechanisms in how you would model all this mathematically, right? Mm-hmm. But it involves embryology. It involves the environment. It involves geology. It involves genetics. It involves all these different mating. So when you say the theory does not explain, what a biologist hears, and I'm just telling you why biologists' heads explode when they hear people talk about this. The theory explains these things rather well. Basically, with all of the other information that Fodor is somehow excluding from the theory, and he keeps calling it the theory of natural selection. Now, let's just call it a part of the theory and call it a mechanism, which is what it is. Okay, just call it a mechanism and rethink all the way that we talk about it. In some respect, the way you worded it makes the same error that evolutionary biologists who are claiming adaptationism are making. They're putting too much weight on one particular part, one particular mechanism, and making claims about it. And you're rejecting those claims. So you see what I mean? And that's
I disagree. I disagree. Fodor's argument is precisely natural selection. Fodor's objection is precisely natural selection isn't and can't be a mechanism because it can't tell what's selected for from what's selected of. Natural selection isn't a mechanism.
But it is a mechanism because it ends up.
It's a mechanism like buy low, sell high is a mechanism.
Well, yeah, it would be a mechanism like that.
Wouldn't it be better to cite that the genes themselves are the mechanisms which natural selection uses to choose the traits?
There are papers on what is a mechanism. There are papers on what is a mechanism. I mean, mechanical thinking and mechanism thinking is also problematic in biology. So there's that.
I don't want to get hung up on mechanism. What I mean here is an explanatory mechanism, not what is a machine or anything like that.
I mean, one facet is like, what can we actually prove? Then there's like, well, what can we theorize? Like as an example, when you were talking about this, I was thinking, well, it seems that there are certain pressures that are occurring that are that are resulting in traits getting selected for. But what you're saying is natural selection in and of itself is not selecting for any of those specific traits. It's just that based on those whatever external pressures, those traits got selected for, they move further down the line.
They got selected of. They selected of. They can't be selected for. Because that's precisely what the environment. Remember, natural selection. What is natural selection? It's just the environment in which organisms find themselves, and that environment doesn't permit every organism to survive, and it doesn't even permit them all to reproduce equally well. So that the environment constitutes a differential reproductive standard against which the organisms, must align themselves, array themselves.
That's right. There's a relationship between those changing parameters and the particular traits. And it may be that the changing, let's just use environmental parameters because it's easy to use as an example. Those are not the only ones, but it seems like environmental parameter X changes, the result of which, and parameter X has an association with traits A and B. Natural selection cannot delineate between A or B. It selects for both A or B.
It selects for neither is what it says. It selects of.
I know.
Well, I'm objecting to the selection for. Because
I got you.
I know what you mean. Yes, we know. We understand each other.
However, I could change my language, but it is interesting to think about. I understand that it's not necessarily selecting for trait A, which is affecting which is connected to environmental pressure A, but trait B is just riding along. It's not really what's it's just riding along. It's not having an effect but it's coming along. But is natural selection selecting only for A, or is it just selecting and just capturing everything? But the intention is really to address environmental pressure. It's just like, how do I put it? I know you're like, it's not selecting for. It's not selecting for A. But my initial question wasn't this at all. My initial question was, why do standardized scientists rule against Fodor?
Oh, I think they just don't understand the distinction between it. I think they just don't understand.
You think they don't understand it? I thought
No, they
they
don't understand the distinction between intentional and extensional predicates. Period. They just don't understand that. That's a logical. It's something in the philosopher's language.
I don't think
logic,
so.
They just don't get.
Okay, I would say that there's misunderstanding on both sides. You know, let's spread the misunderstanding equally here.
Okay, it's the wrong-headed way of basically approaching the problem or criticizing it and saying things like the theory of natural selection when we actually mean that it's one of the mechanisms. And basically it's the language that is being used to attack that makes our heads explode. It's not the intentional versus extensional thing at all. And that isn't all that difficult to understand. In fact, most biologists, when they first hear it, they're like, okay, they think there's something deeper going on than the first blush understanding of it. But the first blush understanding of it is perfect. It's all you need, basically.
I think a lot of the resistance comes from frankly, imputing the wrong motives and intentions to Fodor and anyone who raises the same objection. I mean, Fodor, is at pains. If you read his book, I mean, he's at pains to distinguish himself from all the ID proponents and creationists and stuff like that. And nevertheless, he just gets larded with all of these objections and standard counters from people in the field who think that is what motivates the argument and thinks that it must be wrong for that reason. So I mean, Massimo Pigliucci, this is not a philosophically unsophisticated fellow. He's a philosopher of science. He should have got that right. But if you watch that exchange with that he has with Fodor, and you'll see he's just constantly attributing views to him that he doesn't have, and that he knows Fodor does not hold. And he's not doing it out of any dishonesty. I just think that is sort of the go-to objection. You just assume that people are don't understand the theory of evolution, don't understand natural selection, are confusing natural selection for the whole of evolutionary theory, which is exactly what Pigliucci says. And again, Fodor is saying, I'm not making that mistake. I'm not talking about natural selection as if it's the whole of evolutionary theory. I'm talking about natural selection. You don't have to call it the theory of natural selection. You can call it the mechanism of natural selection. The objection would stand exactly the same way. He's talking about a particular explanatory model, a particular piece of evolutionary theory that's supposed to explain adaptation, right? That's what it's supposed to explain. That's why it's the jewel in the crown of evolutionary theory, right? It's the jewel right here. Evolutionary theory because, things like founder effects and gene drift and pleiotropy and and everything that's neutral selection, none of that explains adaptation. The only thing that explains adaptation is natural selection, because it is a mechanism that is sensitive, or rather explains differential reproductive success and the aggregation over time in a population of fitness conferring traits. That's the beauty of natural selection, is that it's supposed to explain adaptation. And I think it does explain adaptation, but it doesn't do it by virtue of the terms within the theory. There's no conceptual apparatus in the theory that does it. It's everything that does that work is actually extra theoretical. And that's why I came up with this analogy with buy low, sell high. Buy low, sell high doesn't tell you how to play the market, right? But every theory about how to play the market has to be consistent with buy low, sell high if it's going to be true.
I linked this in the description. I think this is the podcast you're talking about. What was Darwin wrong with Jerry and Massimo Pigliucci? Infidel guy?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. That would be the one. Yeah, it's a good discussion. It gets a little heated.
Yeah.
It's an old one. It goes way back. It goes back to shortly after the publication of the book, actually, when Fodor was still alive. I think there's somebody in the house. What is it? Is it Leophilus? Leophilius? Am I getting that right? I think
yes. The second one was correct. Yes, Leophilius.
I beg your pardon, Leophilus. So you had something that you wanted to interject. Am I wrong?
Well, what I wanted to try to do was, because I think I certainly agree with a lot of what Ozzy is saying, but I think I understand the point that Speed is trying to make, and I wanted to present an analogy to try to show how I think both of you are coming from a correct standpoint. So let's replace the terms natural selection with the terms standard model. What this is going to refer to is the standard model of elementary particles. And people might say that, well, natural selection is an attempt at explaining adaptation. Well, I could say that the standard model is an attempt at explaining atoms. But the thing is, standard model isn't really going to explain atoms, because it depends on what about atoms are you trying to explain? Because if you're trying to explain why electrons, or the electron cloud rather, is suspended around the nucleus, you're going to have to appeal to quantum electrodynamics. If you're trying to explain why the protons and neutrons in the nucleus are bound together, you're going to have to appeal to quantum chromodynamics. If you want to explain why the electrons fill orbitals around the atom, you're going to have to appeal to spin statistics theorem. So just saying standard model isn't going to explain anything about an atom. You need an agent to look at the atom and figure out what part of this am I trying to explain. That being said, so I think Ozzy is correct there, that it's intentional. But I think Speed is correct in that what he's trying to say is that within natural selection are a set, a variety of well-defined mechanisms that can be used to explain various aspects of adaptation. And so I think both of you are correct that there are mechanisms in natural selection that help us to explain what adaptation is, just like there are mechanisms within the standard model that help us to explain what atoms are. But you need an agent there. It's intentional in terms of what it is you're trying to explain, and thereby which mechanisms you're going to need to appeal to in order to do that.
Can I just, one minor point?
Very good.
I actually agree with most of what you said there, except that watch out with the word intentional. When I was using the word intentional, I didn't mean what you meant by intentional.
I meant intentional with an S.
Yeah.
What you described as intentional with a T, of intending to what you're trying to explain.
For me, I think that when we talk about even intentional with an S, at least largely when it comes to explanations, that is going to probably result from agents. But I don't think that that means that there's intention with a T necessarily present there.
Okay. Well, okay, maybe not then. Okay. Anyway, anyway, it was a quibble, so don't worry about it.
It's all good. So, but I think that the point that Fodor makes there, that, you know, intentional, I think that does oftentimes go over people's heads, because, you know, it's something that's I don't think it's like super difficult, but I think it's, you know, you got to kind of look at it a couple times to really get it. But I do think, I think the problem is it seems that it's more semantic, that the term natural selection is very broad, and it incorporates a set of mechanisms that we can appeal to account for various aspects of what we see in biological life as it evolves through time, through all of these various set of processes. And what people do is they talk about natural selection as if it's this one thing that explains. Much like the term standard model wouldn't be this one thing that explains. It's a term that incorporates several different mechanisms that could be appealed to account for a variety of things that we observe in reality.
Intention with an S is a kind of a well-understood concept in set theory and mathematics.
And logic, yes, mathematical logic.
But trying to put that together with the semantics of intentionality, the semantic versions of intention, is not the easiest task. Okay, there's a little bit of work that I have to do yet in order to extend from set theory, because like with an intention for a set, right? The more intentional elements you apply, the smaller your set gets. But with extension, the more you apply, the larger your set gets. So,
an example. I know what you mean, but like listeners are not going to know what you mean by the set theoretical definitions.
Right. So if you explain a set extensionally, I might say that it has the numbers 1, 3, 5, and 7, right? Okay. Or 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, ... forever, right? Now, to give an intentional explanation of that set, I would say the set of all odd numbers, okay? But now if I said the set of all odd numbers that are less than 8, then all of a sudden my set would become a lot smaller. And the extension of that I could write out. Of course, you can't write out the extension of an infinite set. You can only intentionally describe it. I could say the set of all odd numbers. So that's basically how intention applies to set theory. And now when And I did some work, and unfortunately I forgot most of the work I did in order to take that over and start talking about Lois Clark and Clark
Superman.
Kent, Superman,
Yeah.
and not Lois Clark. She should be Lois Clark if she marries Superman. But anyway, I digress. But I did some work with that, and it's kind of a contortion of the set theoretical idea in order to come up with this semantical thing. And I still haven't successfully thought it all the way through, but I will someday. And,
well, I can say a little bit about sort of the linguistic phenomena, the sort of the use of intentional and extensional. This is intentional and extensional with an S, again,
Yep.
as opposed to with a T. I can explain that or give examples of that with how it applies in the philosophy of language and why it's relevant to Fodor's critique. Okay, so let's consider. So there are words, there are verbs in English and expressions that are predicates that are intentional and some that are extensional. Okay, so let's consider the predicate looking at, like, John is looking at whatever. Okay, let's imagine that I say that John is looking at the morning star.
Yeah.
All right. Now we all know that the morning star is Venus, right? So if we know that the morning star is Venus, and we know that John is looking at the morning star, it follows that therefore John is looking at Venus, right?
Yep.
It just follows logically. John is looking at the morning star is Venus, therefore John is looking at Venus, right? Or consider is facing. If I say John is facing the morning star, right? And the morning star is Venus, therefore John is facing the morning star, okay? And that's because, again, that logic goes through. That conclusion follows from those premises because looking at and facing, the verb facing, are both extensional. All right, so that is perfectly correct. Now consider the following. Imagine a different predicate. Imagine that I sub in the predicate believes that. If I say, John believes that is the morning star, and we all know that the morning star is Venus. Does it follow that therefore John believes that that is Venus? No, that does not follow. John could believe that that is the morning star, and that could, and of course the morning star is Venus, but he might not know that the morning star is Venus, and so it would not follow that he therefore believes that that is Venus. All right. Believes that is intentional with an S. It's right. The logic doesn't go through. You cannot substitute co-referential terms and produce and preserve the truth value of the syllogism. So you have John is looking at the morning star is Venus, therefore John is looking at Venus. That follows. That is sort of ineluctable logic. It's absolutely true. The conclusion follows from the premises. The syllogism holds, and that's because when you're talking about is looking at, you can substitute co-referential terms like morning star and Venus. But if you use a predicate like believes that, or wants that, or hopes that, or fears that, right? And it's the same thing with function. You cannot substitute co-referential terms and arrive at your conclusion. Now, Fodor's objection in natural selection here is precisely that the notion of something being a function, to say that this functions as that, is to introduce an intentional predicate. Now, you and I can distinguish between intentional predicates. We can assign functions. We can observe and infer functions. But natural selection cannot assign a function, cannot observe a function, cannot discriminate a function. Why? Because it's a blind, mindless, unguided process. And so natural selection cannot differentiate between co-referential traits where one of those traits serves a function and another co-referential or coextensive trait doesn't serve a function. That's precisely what natural selection cannot do. It cannot make these discriminations. It must do exactly what Jason was doing. It just blindly, indiscriminately sweeps all of these coextensive traits in. The function is the reason why it goes through, but natural selection, the theory of natural selection or the mechanism of natural selection cannot do the work of telling us which of those coextensive traits is the functional one. We do that independently of an understanding of the mechanism. We did it before we knew about natural selection. People were doing it before Darwin, and they've been doing it ever since because we never needed Darwin for that. Right? So, and that's the gist of the objection. That's where the intentional extensional distinction.
Okay, here's the problem. with the predicate believes that, okay, these intentional predicates are intentional sentences, right? And we have the term believes that. Now Fodor has taken that and he's come down from a semantic concern, basically it concerns minds and beliefs and things like that, and somehow brought it into something that is a physical theory. And I don't think that works. Okay, we have to still be talking about semantics or how we're thinking about something in order for the intentional criticism to hold. How does it hold with a physical theory?
I think he would say that it's the evolutionist that's making that mistake. It's the evolutionist that is adverting to a concept that is intentional with an S, namely the concept of X functions as Y, or X serves the purpose of Y, and that has to then be cashed out in terms of physics. In terms of
hey, Ozzy, it's good to see you. I'm surprised to hear you use the word evolutionist, because that's almost always used in a derogatory manner.
Well, you should talk to Richard Dawkins about that, because he describes himself as an evolutionist and a Darwinist.
Richard Dawkins is not our buddy anymore. He's not in our club anymore. We don't talk about Richard Dawkins.
He's canceled.
Yeah, he's a curse.
He's canceled, right? He's been Well, he was canceled long before he came up with the recent bullshit. So
my wife is an evolutionary biologist. She calls herself an evolutionist. She calls herself a Darwinist.
Somebody is echoing.
Yeah, I'm not sure who's echoing.
Is it me again?
I could not understand anything you said, Ozzy.
I think it is, because let's see. Yeah, it must be, because it just stopped.
Yeah.
I would say literally everybody else is muted. So
yeah. Okay. So Randolph, I am not an evolutionist. I am an atheist like you. I'm a strong atheist, in fact. I believe in the theory of natural selection. I have no beef with Darwin and Darwinism. I think Fodor's objection is correct. There's no creationism coming from me. You're not going to tar me because I use the word evolutionist.
I'm not trying to tar you. I just pointing out that, I find the usage of that word is pretty much, I've only ever heard people using it in a derogatory.
You should go to a biology department. You should go to a biology department. I could introduce you to my wife if you like.
I thought
She's a quantitative geneticist published in the field of evolutionary ecology and quantitative genetics. She describes herself as a Darwinist, a Darwinian, an evolutionist. Lots of prominent biologists have.
This is a new turn.
If you want some quotes from Richard Dawkins, who I think we would agree is a premier evolutionary biologist, even if he's got some.
Not anymore.
I do have a question. What is evolutionism?
Evolutionism is the same thing as like Marxism. It's just a belief in a set of doctrines or ideas. Right? I mean, you can be.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a heliocentrist. I think that the sun is at the center of our solar system. That makes me a heliocentrist. I believe in heliocentrism. We shouldn't be allergic to these words just because some creationists want to use them. We shouldn't sort of distance ourselves from.
Leo is a standard modelist, I think. Are you a standard?
I am very much a standard. I'm a very strict standard modelist.
Standard modelist? Okay.
No, I wasn't disagreeing with you, Oz. I was just sort of asking, what is evolutionism? Because I knew that you were going to explicate that in a way that shows that it's not just an attempt at dogmatically describing people who adhere to evolution. It's a way of describing people who do adhere to what you could say the standard model of biology is, that life forms evolve through time, in the most simplistic way.
Yeah, I mean, an evolutionist today and an evolutionist in Darwin's day would be completely different. I mean, you could be an evolutionist before Darwin. His grandfather was an evolutionist. It was just someone who subscribed to evolutionary theory as it stood then. The theory has changed. To be an evolutionist today is to be
I don't like it.
Something slightly different than what an evolutionist was 50 years ago and 100 years ago.
It just surprised me to hear you using that term. I never thought I'd hear you say that word.
I'm actually interested. Ozzy, you don't have to say where. I'm just curious, like regionally where your wife works.
She doesn't work in the field anymore. But I mean, she was at McGill University in Montreal.
Oh, okay.
Is where she published her things.
Yeah. Because I work at a modeling institute, and it's NSF funded. It's multidisciplinary, but it's started by molecular genomic modelers. So I'm kind of in that area. I'm not a biologist.
You are an academic though, Jason. So don't sell yourself short here, buddy.
But
Jason, we have to talk.
Oh shit!
So
I feel like sounds my dad was like, "We have to talk." Oh shit! What I do? What I do?
We have to talk.
The birds and the bees talk. Is that the talk we're talking about?
No, that's what you're working on.
I found something in your drawer. Talk.
Why is the car dented?
There's only two the talks that I know of. That's the birds and the bees, and that's I don't know. I think I'm probably the only one here that will understand this one. The other one is the talk about when you're not a
Jason
white
and I have
person living in America, and the things that may potentially happen to you as a result of that. That's the only other talk that I know of.
I'm going to have the bioinformatics talk with Jason. So, I don't know if any of your daddies had that talk with you, but the talk we're going to have.
What do you mean by bioinformatics?
Yeah, what is this?
What is bioinformatics?
You're gonna tell me what about it, or am I gonna have to do a lecture?
No, I'm asking. I have questions for you. You might be able to help.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Quandaries, that sort of thing. Yeah. But anyway, that sounds like if you look at a theory as a hypothesis generator or a statement generator, like if you look at a theory as a generator of statements, semantics, right, that sort of thing, it seems to me that what we have here is a semantic misunderstanding. And I think what biologists are hearing is an attack on the functional mechanism of natural selection, which would just be hilariously ridiculous, right? Nobody wants that, or nobody would do that because that particular bit of mathematics in population genetics is the very basis of any piece of modeling software that we do. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about semantics here, and we're talking about how people think of and frame. And one of the things that you mentioned was selection for, and selection for is a horrible phrase. I mean, those two words should never be put together, right? We had
I agree, but that would be, that's to adopt precisely Fodor's point. Stop talking like that. Stop talking like that.
Well, yep, good.
Is it? Wait a minute,
we can bury him.
Is it that we can't? Is it that it's not selecting for? Or is it that we just don't know? We can't. We have no way of knowing.
I don't think that selection is.
No, we can.
There's no way to.
There's no way of knowing whether it's selecting for trait A, and trait B is riding along, or if it's just throwing out the.
Speed, can I ask you a quick question?
I guess
that might help clear this up. So what? No, I don't think it is. I want to try to clear it up because I think there's something important here. And this is also why I think that not entirely, but I think largely this is a semantic issue. So Speed, when biologists talk about natural selection, and just correct me if I'm wrong here, that's essentially what I want you to do. They're generally talking about this idea that certain traits will fixate in a population over and above other traits over time as a result of the genetic aspects, the genotype, so to speak, interacting with that environment that the population is within.
Yeah, in a way, that's kind of like okay. The problem with selection for is what you got to imagine is we have a population, and we have diversity in that population. And basically over time, over the course of maybe 100 generations, you're going to end up with some sort of, the herd is going to slide to one side, right? There's going to be this big fuzzy thing that happens to one side.
Traits fixate.
Right. And to say that something is selected for, you're almost talking about what would happen in one organism, right? I mean, you're bringing it down to a point where you're saying, oh, that it's almost Lamarckian. You're saying that organism basically, or that trait got into the population because something happened to that organism. I mean, there's a little bit of truth in that, but it's just wrong-headed thinking. Okay, we think in terms of populations and diversity, and natural selection gives you this overall flow. Imagine a lava lamp. You know, how lava lamps form those bubbles and flow around and stuff like that. That's what's going on. Okay. You can't look in one part of that lava lamp and pick out one little part and say, oh, that part, meant or was, was selected to go to the top. That's not how it works. So I mean, that's kind of the problem.
Can I finish my question? Because you're playing toward the conclusion that I'm trying to go here. So with natural selection, at least as I understand it, we're not necessarily looking at like beneficial traits. We're sort of looking at what traits are going to come out, and it seems that there's almost a statistical aspect to it, that what traits could fixate in these populations, what couldn't, when you start looking at it as an individual level. But then you go out and you just start looking at it and saying, okay, we're seeing certain traits fixate over and above others. Sometimes this is beneficial. I think there's even times that it's not, and I think largely it's neither beneficial nor detrimental. Am I correct there?
Yeah. The thing to get away from is this trait idea a little bit, okay?
I'm getting there.
Okay, what ends up going into the model in natural selection is not a trait; it's a massive function of an interaction of environment and genes and organisms and lifetimes and even avalanche.
But natural selection studies all of that too, doesn't it?
Exactly right. But yeah.
Okay, because I want to get to the point. It seems to me that what the problem we're having here is we talk about this as if selection is going on. And when we talk about selection, things like function are involved. And the point is, those, at least to me, seem to be normative terms. So how can we appeal to what happens in the world when we're talking about something that's normative? And this is why, and I'm sort of thinking out loud here because I've been thinking it as this entire stream has been happening. It seems to me, see, in physics, we have terms like axiogenesis, baryogenesis, leptogenesis, sort of how these things come into the world, and then even the ways in which they interact with it. Why don't we, instead of calling it natural selection, call it phenogenesis? How phenotypes come into organisms, into populations, and how they fixate in them. Then we don't have to talk about function, because honestly, those kinds of concepts, I think, are just tangential. We don't need to speak about this in terms of selection and function. What this is are phenogenic processes. They're processes that fixate phenotypes in populations as a result of the ways in which the genotype interacts with the environment that it's in.
Yeah.
You don't need to talk about function, and you don't need to talk about selection.
Scott?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought Leo was done.
I'm done. Sorry.
Yeah, Jefferson wanted to ask the panel a question.
Go ahead, Jefferson. Jefferson fell asleep. No, he didn't.
And I think Ozzy's indicating he wants to get back to Jason's point as well.
Okay.
Yeah, please, if we could at some point, yeah.
Oh, private chat. I should read that once in a while.
Still there, Jefferson?
Jefferson's Spatchcock. All right, let's go back to Jason's point for now then.
Yeah, really?
Jason, you were making what I thought was an excellent point that actually speaks to what Leo was saying. And I have some thoughts on it, but I'd like you to sort of repeat the question if you could, because I thought it was.
I can't even remember what I was saying.
It
was a great point, but no, that's all right. What were we talking about specifically?
Let's see. I'm trying to reformulate what you said there.
He was talking about a modeling institute or something.
No. It was after that. Okay. Oh shoot! Darn! Now I can't remember.
Yeah, let me.
How you worded it, but it was right in the center of the bullseye for me. Okay, well, let me.
I was talking about selecting for trait A, and like that B rides along versus throwing out the wide net for both trait A and B. But however, after I said that, Leo made a point which I thought was really relevant to what I was saying, or what I was saying before. It made me think, which is that natural selection is selecting. It's not selecting what's for. It's essentially removing those that cannot survive. So it's not so. Maybe that's just indirectly selecting for.
It's not exactly right. You'll hear creationists say
maybe I'm wrong. All right.
Creationists will say that natural selection is purely subtractive. It just sort of, it just sort of, winnows out the unfit, but it's not creative. And that's not correct. Natural selection doesn't just kill off the unfit, right? It is it is the mechanism that results in differential reproductive success. In fact, differential reproductive success is the mechanism, right? So
I love that
I mean,
first word.
you can get a trait go to fixation. A trait can go to fixation without a species going to extinction, or without any individuals dying. You can just have a trait go to fixation because one population just one set of alleles just gets represented in the next generation much more so than another allele for that gene, and it just keeps happening and happening and happening. Next thing you know, one allele is just swamped out, and next thing you know, everyone's got 5 fingers and there's virtually no 6-fingered people. So natural selection doesn't just cull out the unfit. You can have differential reproductive success that will result in a change in allele frequencies. That's the definition of evolution. And so you'll get evolution even if nothing dies. If you had a universe where every organism was immortal, you'd still get evolution. You'd still get a change in allele frequencies because presumably some organisms could leave more surviving offspring than their conspecifics in the population, and the next generation would reflect those genes. They'd be overrepresented in some offspring and not in others, or in some individuals and not others' offsprings. So natural selection is constructive. It is not merely destructive. The creationists are wrong when they say this. And it allows fitness-conferring traits to aggregate, to accumulate over time in a population, which is why things can become better adapted over time. It's why our eyes are so much better than the eyes of certain other organisms, but not as good as an eagle's, and so forth. But there's a tendency, I've been hearing it from a few different sources now. Speeds said it, Leo, you seem to say it, and I think, Jason, you were sort of alluding to this as well, that maybe it's just if we could just change the way we talk. But it's not just a matter of changing the way we talk. We can't, yes, I agree that we've got to stop talking perhaps using the idiom of selection for and selection of, that it can be very misleading. But the only reason we would need to do that is because it's not natural selection that selects for and of. But that's not to say that it's wrong to say that eyes were selected for seeing, hearts for pumping blood, hands for grasping, teeth for chewing. Teeth were selected for chewing. Eyes were selected for seeing, and so forth, right? Those functions are real. Those are real functions. That is part of the right explanation for why we have eyes at a certain level of generality. So we don't want to expunge this from natural selection because it is precisely the notion of function that explains adaptation, right? It is precisely because eyes are for seeing that we have eyes, and that eyes have gotten better over time, and hands have gotten better at grasping, and so forth. Function is an important, a causally, physically, explanatorily relevant part of our understanding of why traits have or why organisms have the traits that they do. It's not a coincidence, it's not an accident, right? It's not intentional, it's not guided, it's non-purposive, it's non-teleological, but it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence that eyes are for seeing. Eyes really are for seeing. So the notion of function, of a proper function, is necessary in evolution because adaptations are functional, right? There are other mechanisms of evolution that are non-adaptive, pleiotropic effects, gene drift, founder effects, all of that stuff. None of that, all of that neutral stuff, none of that is adaptive. Function plays no role in that, in understanding why that happens. But function is relevant in understanding natural selection. Fodor's point is not that function doesn't belong in the theory. His point is that the concept of natural selection does not contain within it any conceptual tools that would help us decide which coextensive traits are the functional ones. We do that without knowing natural selection or knowing about it or anything like that. We were doing it for millennia before. We never needed it. And the more you understand about organisms and their environment, the better we are at sussing out which coextensive traits are the functional ones, and so that's why those are the fitness conferring ones. We are able to tell which ones are fitness conferring.
Are you saying that are you saying that natural selection can never discern? Are you saying that there? I guess I'm just trying to understand the differences between currently natural selection cannot identify trait between discern
Biologists
between trait A and trait
can.
B, or and biologists can, fair enough, but natural selection as a mechanism cannot. Are you saying that just as the mechanism as it is, just the way that the mechanism is structured, it just inherently, it is not meant to do that?
Yeah, well, no, it was meant to do that, but it can't do that. And part of the reason, I mean, Fodor has this sort of idea about the reason why Darwin thought this was because he understood artificial selection, where there is a fitness conferring standard. The person who's doing the breeding of animals has a standard. I want my pigeon to look like such and such. I want my Jack Russell Terriers to, come out a certain way or something like that. And so where artificial selection is concerned, and he was himself a pigeon breeder and bred animals and stuff like that. So he understood artificial selection very well. And if you've read The Origin of Species, you know that he starts by talking about artificial selection and then models natural selection on that. And he says, well, look, if breeders can turn one thing into practically a completely different looking animal over time, then surely nature over vastly more experiences and reproductions over a wider population, over a wider area, over a huge amount of time can transform one species into another species, right? So he calls it natural selection because he's modeling it on artificial selection. According to Fodor,
it's the same thing.
What's that?
There's no difference between.
There is no difference. I agree. There is no difference. But Fodor, I mean, there is no difference. It's just that we're the selective pressure when it comes to artificial selection.
Right.
And we're the selective standard in the environment. Our desires and what we want to see the outcome constitutes the selective standard against which organisms get to leave more surviving offspring or not. That's all. I mean, we're just part of the environment that constitutes the selective standard. So there is no difference between artificial and natural selection. But Darwin was saying, look, and he understood that too. Darwin, if you read Darwin on The Origin of Species, he's very clear on this. He understands that humans constitute the selective standard. And he thinks, okay, if I can get people to understand artificial selection and how much we can change, how mutable species can be through artificial selection, if I get them to buy that and understand that, they'll appreciate that over virtual infinity of breedings in the wild over a huge amount of time, species could transmogrify from looking like one thing into another thing, and you can get speciation events, right? And so, and all that's different there is the selective standard is different, and it's unguided, and it's non-purposive. There isn't an agent behind it that constitutes the selective standard. There's just a blind and different environment that constitutes the selective standard. Fodor thinks that because Darwin starts with, in his method of explanation of the theory of the mechanism, starts with artificial selection, he comes to imagine that idiom of selection will work, when in fact he chose the wrong idiom. He should not have chosen that kind of talk. But if he had thought about it more clearly, he would have realized that that's precisely what natural selection can't do, is select. And so he would not have adopted the expression natural selection. In fact, he doesn't actually introduce it right away. That's sort of actually somebody else's idea.
What was your term for it, Leo? What did you call it?
What did I call it? Phenogenesis.
Phenogenesis.
Yeah, essentially the development of and potential fixation of phenotypes as genotypes within populations, as genotypes within organisms interact with the environment into which the population is subject.
I mean,
Jason, I just want to tie this in a bow. So your question was spot on. The point that I'm making here is this. We don't want to get rid of the concept of selection. We just don't want to attribute it. We don't want to think that it's the theory of natural selection that allows us to make the discrimination between what is selected for and what is selected of. It's not that we can't ever talk about these things. We can. Just don't assign them to natural selection. In a way, the theory is misnamed. Don't call it the theory of natural selection. Call it the theory of something else. But it's we who figure out. It is we, by our understanding of organisms and their environments, that are able to figure out what is functionally relevant in making one trait among a suite of coextensive traits. Which of those traits is the fitness conferring one by virtue of the function that it serves in the overall economy of the organism? So yes, we can keep the concept of function and
it's taken. I've had to have like 4 different discussions on this Jerry Fodor discussion over and over again with Danny. I've had it with like Danny like 3 times, and
Danny
like,
never makes any progress.
but I actually makes sense to me. It's starting to come together for me. So I appreciate Ozzy taking the time to do that.
I want to point out that purifying selection or selection against negative selection is constructive, and that's how like, okay, if we have mutation, if we did not have any way to cut out a great massive amount of that differentiate or the differentiation, if we didn't have that, then a species would just run rampant, and we'd all have you'd have 5 limbs and nose coming out of your ear, and there wouldn't be any constraint, right? So basically, the purifying selection is very, very functional in constructing diversity, that sort of thing. So that's number one. And the positive selection is required, although if for roughly the same reason, without any selection at all. If there was no selection pressure, then species would just be way too diverse. Every individual would be different, that sort of thing. So I mean, it's an important part of the whole. And you've got to look at it, though, in terms of populations over time. And you can't look at it, and you have to understand the mutation and the reproduction part, all the different parts of natural selection. And you can create computer models where you can create some remarkable bits of life with just computer models constructively, right? Now, if it was intelligently designed and selected for certain traits, then I think organisms would be far less diverse than they are.
Well,
the diversity is explained by the randomness.
Don't a lot of Christians? Sorry, am I getting feedback?
No, there's an echo.
Oh, Jesus Christ! StreamYard I got to get rid of StreamYard. I'm telling you, it's got to go. Goodbye.
Oh, it's speed. Every time that happens, like speed has to leave and then come back in.
Takes a dive.
But I was just thinking, like, Fodor's position is it a position that is taken by Christians as an argument?
Well, I've never heard a Christian who understood it.
Okay,
they try.
Yeah, the answer is yes, but they do it poorly.
We do hear a Christian actually marshal that argument and get it right. What they end up doing is they filter Fodor through their own sort of, ID proponents.
Worldview.
Basically, it boils down to, selection requires a selector, and so they think a mind is required. Natural selection doesn't have a mind, therefore natural selection can't happen.
Okay,
that is a completely lunk-headed version of what Fodor is talking about. Fodor is talking about a distinction between intentional and extensional predicates. Selection 4 is an intentional predicate. Yes, if you had a mind, if the environment had a mind, then yes, it could do this.
But you know what? The way that you explained this, really, I'm glad we had this conversation because it really makes sense. Because the aspect of like the combination of having some directionality combined with randomness is really interesting. So it's because like, so as an example, in the scenario you're proposing, you're saying, well, look, it's a natural selection is a little bit more broad. It's a little bit more like not really it's not selecting for a particular trait. It's kind of like a big mass. It's like a big ship. It can only kind of move a little bit in this direction, and there are ripples around the side. So there's a lot of the confidence intervals are wide on natural selection, and can't get it exactly right, but it can kind of shift the direction. It's like a lot of systems. It's like they take a lot to move. They're very affected by feedback. So changes over time will make them change, but then they can't shift back in another direction really quick. So that strikes me as very like, I'm trying to think, like, would that be an argument that a Christian would take? I guess it would be like, well, natural selection
Yeah.
Natural selection can't actually select specifically, and that's where God comes into play, like you were saying.
Yeah,
That makes
I mean,
sense.
they could sort of avail themselves of that. I haven't heard anybody do that. I mean, my understanding of it, when I have heard them invoke the name of Fodor, they just think, here's a guy, a real big shot in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of mind, who has pointed out a problem. They don't understand the distinction between intentional and extensional. They don't understand enough typically about evolutionary theory to understand where he is aiming his objection.
He's not a biologist, though, is he? Is he a biologist?
No, but I mean, he just knows a ton about evolutionary theory.
And he's died, right? He's dead.
He's the late Jerry Fodor. Yeah, he died a few years ago. Yeah, unfortunately. It's
really
funny because
anyway.
I was actually creating a video. I was starting to script a video about this because I had done a number of hangouts where we discussed this with sort of my fellow atheists who were sort of struggling to come to terms with what the objection was and wasn't. And I was trying to sort of disabuse some people of some misunderstandings that they had of it. And I had a question for Jerry Fodor, and I was sort of writing this email to him because I've met him a long time ago when he gave a talk at McGill University, and not that I thought he'd remember me, but I just felt, he's pretty approachable. So I'll write him an email, and I was composing this email, and I put it off, and I put it off, and I put it off, and then I suddenly heard that he died.
Oh no!
And I was like,
terrible.
And it would have been like the first upload I'd done in like 2 years or something like that. And I was so pissed. Yeah, and I was so I deleted the email in a sort of fit of pique because he actually was. Fodor is an interesting fellow in the philosophy of mind. He's a guy who's changed his mind so many times. He's
philosophy of mind, huh?
Oh yeah,
I didn't know he did work there too.
Oh yeah, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind. Primarily, he's known for the philosophy of mind, and
I did not know that.
Yeah, no, he's sort of
apparently not. Apparently, he's known for for natural selection, not philosophy of mind.
No, this was sort of a mistake. This is the biggest mistake of his career. It's philosophy of language too.
Yeah,
was a big. He made big contributions there.
Yeah,
but
So anyway, so he was kind of an interesting fellow because he changed his mind a lot. He was one of these guys who would like advance a theory, he would champion it, he would just ram it home until he became convinced by the objections, and he'd just suddenly abandon it, and he just do a sort of an about face, and people would go like, how the heck did you change your mind like this? Like he was kind of like Wittgenstein. He had this capacity to completely reverse himself when he realized he'd made a mistake. He didn't reverse himself on this one,
which is weird, but
well, I think he's
right. Jerry Fodor was the one
so
that did
I'm glad he didn't reverse himself, and I hope that he wouldn't have, but because I think he's right. The problem is this. Because he has a criticism of natural selection, people assume that he thinks that natural selection isn't real. He doesn't believe in evolution. All this stuff. None of that is right. Like, people who think that of him and think that those are his motivations have not read his book and don't know anything about Jerry Fodor. He's not a crypto creationist or intelligent design proponent or anything of the sort. I mean, he's a sort of a hard-boiled naturalist. And if you knew anything about his philosophy of mind, his philosophy of language, you'd be able to appreciate that as well, just on the basis of that. So he's not coming from there, but I think we're so used to, those of us who are sort of pro-science boosters and sort of pro-Darwinian in our thinking and anti-creationist in our thinking, we're so used to hearing criticisms of evolution coming from a religious sources, not a secular source. We have a hard time processing that there can be someone from a completely naturalistic secular mindset, an atheist, come up with a fairly compelling objection to the theory. But he's not even saying that the theory of evolution is wrong or that natural selection is wrong, just that we attribute something to natural selection for which it does not deserve credit. The credit goes to the biologist. As he says, biologists are smarter than their theories. And when it comes to trying to figure out which of the coextensive traits are the ones that have a fitness conferring function that actually explains why the trait sticks around, they're availing themselves of information that is extra theoretical than outside the theory of natural selection proper. they're availing themselves of the whole pile of stuff, physiology, embryology, biochemistry, genetics, all the rest of it, and just a ton about the environment, engineering, an understanding of engineering, physical constraints, allometry, just tons and tons of stuff that they availed themselves of, but that they were doing before Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection. If they were doing it before Darwin came along, you can't credit it with Darwin with accomplishing that, right? So that's why he says that biologists are smarter than their theory.
Yeah, the interesting thing is a couple of creationists, Sel Cordova and Emery Moyna, read a paper called "What's Wrong with Evolutionary Biology," and they completely misunderstood what the paper was about. The paper was about what is wrong with evolutionary biologists fighting each other and talking about what's wrong with evolutionary biology. That's what the paper was about. And it was he was making the case that it was kind of there like Lewontin and Lynch and a number of others have just come down on all of these different theories, and there's always this big fight going on in evolutionary biology. So it isn't the first time there's been a criticism of natural selection or adaptionism or any of this stuff. And it's just that I think in some way that it was the language and it was the style and it was the way Fodor brought it in that he ended up getting rejected so badly. And he does make some pretty goddamn crazy statements in some of his papers. So I'd have to highlight a few of them. And it just sort of pissed a lot of people off, but no more than they're pissed off at each other already is the point I'm trying to make. There's just all this fighting going on with the extended synthesis. Like if you mention extended synthesis to Dr. Dan, his head explodes. What do we need? We don't need no goddamn extended, because the extended synthesis sort of talks about a lot of things that everybody already knew, right? And that's the feeling we keep getting, is that we already knew this shit. Okay, what are you telling us this for? So anyway, it's all just humans are amazing critters, and we often fly off the handle before we give it a good think, I think, anyway. So Jefferson, you had something that you wanted to ask us. Are you still with us? Yeah, there you are.
You can't hear him.
No.
He had some mic troubles earlier.
Oh, okay.
no.
Maybe it's a mic. Yeah. Not entirely sure.
Am I coming through now?
Yeah, you are now.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with this thing today, but yeah. So I wanted to kind of roll back to the part where I think Ozzy had mentioned that the issue that Fodor is kind of bringing up, this kind of usage of natural selection in this problematic way. Stephen Gould had used it that way, maybe Richard Dawkins as well. For somebody who's starting to get into studying evolutionary biology, who would be some of the best people to read from, and maybe who would be some of the people to avoid, to kind of maybe avoid some of these misconceptions? Or is it not possible to avoid this misconception?
Are you asking me?
You have to read everybody.
Well,
I'm asking anyone in the panel who's
if you want to, you have to basically read everybody, and you have to read the guys that are pushing back and fighting. And that's why when Fodor come up and raised his hand, that's why everybody, the entire room, turned to him and said, "What?" Because you have to take these criticisms, right? Because each one modifies our thinking overall. Because what is life is an incredibly complex thing that we haven't quite got our minds around yet. And so you have to keep turning back and forth and fighting it out. I wouldn't say there was one person that you could follow that would give you everything, other than, the Pilucci and Lynch and Lewontin and the big names, Gould and even Gould, all of them. You
had to come close.
But what you don't want to do is like pick Dawkins.
No, that's what I meant. Yeah, because
yeah, you don't want to pick Dawkins. I don't know. He's a little outdated.
He's a turf.
If
Well, he had a good
on the forum. I have a lot of things organized for helping people get the basics of these things.
What are you doing?
Yeah, it's a tough field. Still trying to
my
wrap my
feeling is you're
mind
not going
around.
to anybody in the field who's not going to sort of fall into this mistake. Anyone who's writing for the lay reader is just going to intrude all over this mistake, and that's because the theory is just sort of assumed to explain fitness conferring traits in terms of proper functions. It's just quite, no pun intended, quite natural for us to talk in terms of traits having functions and serving purposes. And even though we know that we're not speaking teleologically, that we're speaking of a blind, mindless, unguided process, and that we mean when we talk about function, we mean the term teleonomically, not teleologically. Nevertheless, we are employing a normative standard. It's a normative concept. So I don't think we're going to be able to get around that. And we want a theory that explains things in terms of functions, because traits do persist. Adaptive traits, that is. Adaptive traits do persist because of the functions that they serve in the overall ecological economy of an organism. So we have to have a theory that has that. We just should not make the mistake of thinking that natural selection allows us to discriminate between which are the fitness conferring traits based on function from all the other coextensive ones. We are able to do that, but we don't do it on the basis of the theory of natural selection. We do it on the basis of extra theoretical understanding of organisms. But I don't think you're going to read, I've read practically everything Gould has written, and I've read most of Dawkins's books, and stuff by Richard Lewontin, and all the popularizers, and Simpson and Hamilton, and I read all of that stuff, and it's just replete. That assumption is implicit in all of their work, so I don't think you can escape it. But we can be cognizant of it, and we can just hope that eventually, from my standpoint, I hope that eventually evolutionary theorists become sort of more cognizant of this, and so if it's salient to them, they won't make the mistake of talking this way. But we can't avoid talking about functions. It's absolutely critical to a proper explanation of why some traits exist. Not all traits are fitness conferring, not all of them are adaptive, but the ones that are best explained in terms of function. And so we want to beat that.
I've got a bee in my bonnet about functionalism, so.
Yeah, well, you don't have to be a functionalist. You don't. Functionalism is sort of understood to be a kind of default assumption where you assume everything has some kind of function, and I don't think that we can do that. That's a mistake. So I'm not recommending or endorsing functionalism here, but we have to understand that there are functions. It is precisely the functions to which we appeal when we try to explain the fitness conferring traits that constitute adaptations.
Yeah.
Because not everything in evolution is an adaptation, but the adaptations are explained in terms of a function. And that is an intentional concept, an intentional predicate, intentional with an S.
Yep.
Anyway, gentlemen, I have to go. This has been a really fun discussion, though. Thank you very much for
we all have.
I know you had this over and over again with people, but I appreciate you hearing me out on it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for showing up.
Having you on.
Great.
Hopefully, this puts the nail in the coffin of the discussion. But we all have to go because it's 6:00, and we got to shoot it in the head now. So we're all going to leave.
What's your issue? What's your issue with functionalism?
It's kind of wrong-headed thinking, that sort of thing, and I'm too tired tonight to explain why I think that. But I'm looking
at consciousness as a result of the functions of the brain.
No, I'm looking at biochemical pathways as networks, basically collective networks, and as small world networks, and looking at the mathematics and biochemical pathways. And there is there's a problem with looking at it functionally. Okay.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there are many pathways out there that are co-functional and many, many more pathways that are not functional. And I'm looking at protein-protein interactions particularly, and the databases that we have for that. And it's all half-baked in my head, and that's all I want to say about it right now, Leo. I don't want to get into it.
Wait, are you talking about functionalism about the mind or something else?
Oh, well, about the mind too. It's kind of a problem. No, I'm talking about biochemical functionalism.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm talking about like functionalism with respect to the mind.
Looking at an organism that has eyes and saying the phrase, the eyes function to do something or whatever. Looking at the entire story of how eyes came to be as a functional story, I think is problematic. And I can't articulate right now exactly why I think that. But anyway,
well, I mean, I agree. Talking about like traits or phenotypes in terms of the term, using the word function, I don't think it's the right way.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys would, I again, not my area of expertise, but aren't I correct in saying that eyes developed progressively over like they were one thing and they evolved to another and another. Eventually they became this thing, what was the eye, but they may have even had other functions beforehand along the way to eventually get to the eye. So it's like, not like how did the eye come to be, but it's like what was the steps along the way that led to what we now know as the eye. You probably could go back and be like, oh, look at this point in time, that actually spun off this stuff over here, and at this point in time this spun off this stuff over here. I mean,
one thing I've wondered about is if we've at some point as a species, or maybe prior to our species, lost a rod that can detect ultraviolet.
Yeah, possible. But the thing is, the eye undoubtedly started out, its very, very early meager beginnings was as a free rider. Basically, it was not, and that's the thing. Everything starts out as a free rider, and what ends up in the future is just a very, very complicated story. And it isn't just strictly functionalism.
I mean,
that gets you to that story?
What's the first manifestation of the eye in any species, or like even the precursor to the eye, like
just having the protein that can basically change its conformation based on a packet of light. And end up connecting to interfacing to another protein that does something else right? That operates as cilia or whatever. The accidental chain of events that led to organisms that can detect light and move toward or away from it, that sort of thing. And,
I think trilobites were the first thing to have what we would now represent as an eye, roughly 550 million years ago or something.
I think it was even in the Ediacaran or whatever, where we probably ended up. Well, photoreceptors were probably very, very early in bacteria, 2 billion years ago, maybe. Something like that.
According to New Scientist, the first eyes appeared about 541 million years ago at the beginning of the Cambrian period, when complex multicellular life really took off, and a group of now extinct animals called trilobites, which looked a bit like large marine woodlice.
So,
go ahead.
I was going to say to Randolph's thing, I thought if you guys are still going back and forth on that, go ahead.
Nope, we're not. We're trying to shoot it in the head at 6 o'clock. That's 6.
Don't disappear right away, because I have a link for you, Speed, that I think you'll like.
Okay, good.
But Randolph, the inners of the human eye can see down to like 300 nanometers, so that's within the ultraviolet spectrum. Just the lenses filter it. People that have their lenses removed report seeing ultraviolet light as like a whitish violet color.
Oh wow! Yep. Nice. Okay, guys, so let's.
That's why the sun is white.
What do you say we quit?
Hey, good guest today with Ozzy.
Oh
yeah, that was very impromptu. We're lucky to have him just hop in.
I saw him come on, and I was like, I saw him in the chat, and I'm like, the fuck.
That was great.
I saw him join, and I'm like, the fuck.
I would have paid him, but don't tell
nice
him that.
to talk with him again. We've spoken a few times in the past.
Yeah, we had a private talk about this, and we tend to disagree a little bit about this. Yeah, I think, but a lot was cleared up today, so it was pretty good. So anyway, I'll have to get my thinking right. Okay, guys, we're gonna shoot her in the head. Goodbye, cruel world.
Stay curious.
Hey, take care.